Welcome back. Today's book is a fairy tale, but like all fairy tales, it's not just a story. It shares a lesson with us about how we should live in this world. Let's read. Extra Yarn, written by Mac Barnett, illustrated by John Klassen. Mac grew up in California and graduated from Pomona College, where he studied literature. He was always obsessed with books and knew he wanted to be a writer, but he didn't figure out what kind of writer until he worked at a kids' camp in Berkeley one summer. He would make up stories for the kids and gained a reputation as the man with the fantastical tales. John says his family didn't have a huge library of kids' books at home when he was growing up. They just went to the library a lot. But when he visited his grandfather, his dad's old room, one wall where all his books were kept, including a whole bunch of book club picture books from the 1960s. Things like Dr. Seuss, P.D. Eastman. And he would sleep in that room, and he'd pull down piles of books onto the bed and spend hours in there. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town, where everywhere you looked was either the white of snow or the black of soot from chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars too, but there was still extra yarn. And when Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turned out he was. And even after she made a sweater for Nate and his dog, and for herself and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet!" shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone!" "Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Then I'll knit one for everyone," Annabelle said, "so they don't have to turn around." "Impossible," said Mr. Norman. "You can't." But it turned out she could. And she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabelle still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad, and for Mr. Pendleton and Mrs. Pendleton, and for Dr. Palmer, and for little Louie. She made sweaters for everyone, well, except Mr. Crabtree. Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat. And even then, Annabelle still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs, and all the cats, and for other animals too. Soon, people thought, soon Annabelle will run out of yarn. But it turned out she didn't. So Annabelle made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn. And people came to visit from around the world to see all the sweaters and to shake Annabelle's hand. One day, an archduke, who was very fond of clothes, sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabelle. "Little girl," said the archduke, "I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I am willing to offer you $1 million. "No, thank you," said Annabelle, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. $2 million, he said. Annabelle shook her head. "No, thanks." $10 million, shouted the archduke. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," said Annabelle. "I won't sell the yarn." And she didn't. So that night, the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabelle's house, and they stole the box and took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea back to his castle. The archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box, and he lifted its lid, and he looked inside. His mustache quivered. It shivered. It trembled. The archduke hurled the box out of the window and shouted, "Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again." Oh, what's happening? But it turned out she was. The end. So in the end, it turned out that Annabelle was happy again. In spite of the archduke's curse, she got back her magic box of yarn that never ran out, and the evil archduke was foiled in his attempt to keep it just for himself. So, what do you think? Why did the yarn never run out for Annabelle? I thought about it, and it struck me that Annabelle's yarn maybe didn't run out because she didn't hoard its magic for just herself. She shared the yarn with everyone and everything around her, unlike the evil archduke who just wanted the yarn for himself. So maybe the moral of this fairy tale was sharing with others blesses both you and your neighbors. And in Annabelle's case, a pickup truck who apparently didn't realize it needed a sweater. This lesson about sharing is something all of us began to learn in preschool, when we discover we can't hoard all the blocks or all the cars or all the Barbie dolls. That a community that shares is much happier than one that doesn't, right? Come back next week and we'll read another story together. Bye-bye.